Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for those joining us from the other side of the pond. My name is Zsuzsanna Végh, and I'm a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Today, we have the opportunity to welcome you for a very interesting and timely discussion on the future of the European neighborhood policy, which also serves as the launch of a paper written by one of our amazing ReThink.CEE fellows, Khrystyna Parandii. Khrystyna is a political scientist and analyst with a background in international relations and European studies. She has been working on both as a practitioner and as an analyst. She's been working on the EU integration of Ukraine and the Europeanization of the country. And in the course of her one-year fellowship, she has been focusing on the potentials for reforming the European neighborhood policy, now covering not only the Western Balkans, but also Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. In the course of this discussion, Khrystyna will present us her findings. And we have the luck to have two great colleagues, researchers joining us, who will be discussing the topic with Khrystyna with us today. We have with us today Stephen Blockmans, the Director of Research from the Center for European Policy Studies from Brussels, who has been long focusing on the EU's foreign and neighborhood policy and is one of the foremost experts on the subject, seeing the topic also from the Brussels bubble, but also beyond. And we also have with us today Florian Bieber, professor of history and political science at the University of Graz, who has been long focusing on the southeastern European region and has extensive experience and expertise on the countries of the Western Balkans. So I think we have a great group today on the panel with us who can cover this timely topic, both from the Eastern European, Western Balkans, and EU side. Why are we talking about EU enlargement today? The past year has given the policy an unexpected momentum. We have seen the countries of Eastern Europe moving towards their long-awaited European prospect. Ukraine and Moldova got the candidate status from the European Union, although unfortunately the war of Russia has been a big contributor to this. At the same time, we have seen movement in the Western Balkans too. Albania and North Macedonia have started their negotiation process with the European Union. This has been a momentum on both the Western Balkan and the Eastern European end that has long been missing from the policy. At the same time, we should not believe that this momentum will automatically last. There are still unresolved issues. There are still problems both on the candidate side and also on the side of the European Union, which without close attention will not resolve themselves. So the reason why we are here today is to discuss what reforms would be necessary to keep this momentum going, what is the balance of the past 1 year, and where the policy is headed. We will start out with Khrystyna giving us an introduction to her research in 15-20 minutes, summarizing her findings and her recommendations towards the reform of the policy. And then we will move on with comments first from Florian and Stephen. You in the audience will, of course, also have the opportunity to ask questions, share your views with us. For this, I would encourage you to please use the Q&A and the chat function. In the course of the discussion, I will be picking up your questions and we will bring them into the discussion with our speakers today. So without further ado, Khrystyna, I would like to pass the floor to you and very much looking forward to your findings.
Good afternoon, and many thanks to Zsuzsanna for this opening, and lots of thanks to Florian and Stephen for joining the discussion today, and of course for all of our attendees for joining us and being with us here. Indeed, as Zsuzsanna has just mentioned, the decision of the EU to grant the candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova last June was historical, and that's for a number of reasons, but I would like to highlight two, which I was focusing on in my research. And that's the geopolitical and the institutional aspect of the thing. So first and foremost, we saw that the enlargement policy has once again became at the heart of the EU's geopolitical interests. And that was after a couple of years of stagnation when it came to the enlargement policy vis-a-vis the Western Balkans before. So what we saw after the Ukraine and Moldova decision was the opening of talks with North Macedonia and Albania. We saw the candidate status granted also to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, which submitted its membership application. And that just reinforced this idea that for EU, the enlargement is once again something that it sees as the tool to promote its interests and to project its power in the world. But what was even more interesting and significant was the institutional change, which occurred to the EU's approach to its neighbors. And up until 2022, we saw the so-called two-basket approach when we had the group of Western Balkan countries and Turkey, which were grouped as eligible candidate in the EU's perception for eventual membership, and they were approached from the perspective of the enlargement policy. At the same time, we had the distinct European Eastern Partnership policy, which was designed particularly for Eastern partners, Ukraine, Moldova, but also other countries which are lagging behind right now in their European aspirations. And that was something which was designed from the onset as the alternative to enlargement. And of course, there was a very contested approach from the side of the countries which were in the second group, which did not agree with the logic of not being eligible and being just friendly neighbors. And Ukraine was particularly vocal about that. So last year, we saw this wall being removed, and we saw that we don't have any distinctions anymore. So basically, now we have a big group of the enlargement policy, which covers 10 countries. In my research, I did not really focus on Turkey, for obvious reasons, but basically those are the two new Eastern countries, and the rest of them are Western Balkans. And for me, as somebody who has followed the European integration discussion, both from the Ukrainian side and from the EU side for years before the historical decision last year, it was also striking how you saw all of these disagreements over having the separate EAP policy rather than having Ukraine and other Eastern neighbors as the potential candidates. So now this controversy between the blocks has been removed, and we have big basket instead of the two basket approach. So of course, what we received is this very good positive dynamics of the movement towards both regions from the EU side. We also saw some elevated expectations, particularly from the side of Ukraine and Moldova. And these elevated expectations often go hand by hand with the statements about the speedy accession and about some unrealistic timeframes for enlargement. And it creates the general idea that, well, now it's basically the matter of a couple of years when we will see the completion for the accession process of some of the countries, which of course is far from the reality. And what we can expect is also the risk in addition to the opportunities which we are seeing with the new big enlargement group. Because when we look at the existing challenges and the pre-existing issues which the EU had with Western Balkans, we can project almost all of them for the future struggles of Ukraine and Moldova. So my idea with this paper was just to bridge this expectation reality gap, both on the side of the candidate countries, but also to discover how this gap can be bridged from the point of view of reforms, of additional steps which the EU can do, and just consider this as the comprehensive process which involves all of the sides. So that was one dimension of why I decided to proceed with my paper on this issue. And another one was the so-called compartmentalization of the topic at the initial stages of the discussions about granting Ukraine and Moldova candidacy status, because we saw many arguments about moral criteria of why this should happen. We saw also lots of hesitations about the European Union's absorption capacity. We saw proposals for reforms of the process, reforms of the EU. So we saw many of these aspects, but very often particular stakeholders, and here we talk either member states or candidate countries, they focus exclusively on their own interests, and this bigger picture is missing. And this is really crucial to help help all the parties involved to understand that we can't approach this just from this siloed perspective. So my second objective with this paper was to provide the comprehensive overview of what do we have in the form of the enlargement policy right now? What are the shortcomings? What are the things which can be tweaked? And also what each of the involved parties can do. And that's, of course, something which I will touch upon in the recommendation part to make this policy work. And when I say to make this policy work, I don't mean necessarily the accession as the complete act, as the end goal of this process, but also the transformative and quite useful path which precedes the accession itself. And this is also something which is very difficult to overestimate, because the potential within the enlargement process and not just the enlargement as such is huge. And it will be a pity to miss this opportunity and not to take advantage of all of this transformational dynamics which the policy can bring to the region. So those were the two objectives I had in mind. And as I mentioned before, when I started to have a look at the configuration of the policy and also at the existing challenges, basically I grouped them into three broad categories, and they were relevant for the experience of the Western Balkan countries for the past 20 years, and they are quite relevant for Ukraine and Moldova, and potentially also Georgia in case it is granted candidacy status anytime in the future. And those concern the three issues. First is the internal dynamics in the candidate countries. This concerns political situations, polarization, lack of reforms. So whatever is happening within the borders of these candidate countries. And of course, now we can also add the war dynamics and conflict dynamics, which is relevant not only for Ukraine, but also for Moldova and again, Georgia, in case it is ever recognized as candidate country too. The second big group of issues concerns the political will on the part of the EU. The reasons are numerous. Sometimes we have seen the cases of politicization of the process by individual member states. We saw that very vividly with the pass of North Macedonia, which struggled a lot to overcome a number of European vetoes over some historical issues with its neighbors. And of course, that's something which we can expect in regard to Ukraine and Hungary. And of course, these issues, even with the existing candidates with the Western Balkans, they have never disappeared. And the third final group of concerns and shortcomings concerns the internal institutional dynamics of the EU. So that's not so much about the political will, but even provided that political will is there, there is still a question how the EU should keep functioning, having a huge amount of member states, given that we already see some difficulties with decision making, given that we have huge gaps between the net contributors and net beneficiaries of the EU budget. And of course, that concerns more institutional things like the requirements of qualitative or qualitative majority voting or unanimity. So all of these procedural changes which have to be made before we can speak about the proper absorption capacity on the EU side. So when we look at this three groups of big concerns, we can also project that we probably are moving in the right direction in terms of addressing those. Again, if we recall the discussions which were happening just last summer, they were more compartmentalized and they were more focused on very distinct aspects of these issues. Now, what we have seen in the course of the past month, and that was already after I finished my paper and was very happy to see that we are moving in the right direction, when the political discourse on the level of the EU leadership or at the level of individual countries such as France or Germany, they have started to highlight some of these issues and they have started to approach the enlargement policy and its future from the more strategic perspective, having that in mind, having the objective of making it work, but trying to find the solutions. And of course, now in 2023, we are in the year preceding the general elections to the European Parliament, and the new commission will be formed as a result of this election. So we can very much expect that the enlargement question along with all of these groups of concerns, which I mentioned, will be on the agenda, not only this year, but also for the years to come. Probably that can be something which the next EU institutions will be heavily focusing on. So, of course, the recommendations which are tried to put together to different stakeholders involved, they probably will remain relevant also as we enter all of these more detailed discussions. I also would like to make a disclaimer that, of course, I couldn't go into details of each of the particular aspects, especially when it comes to the absorption capacity and how it should work for a budget and how it's going to work for the institutional setup. But those were the general strokes, broad strokes, which I wanted to highlight just to ensure that we are not missing out in the list of things to be done before we can really have the credible and effective enlargement policy. So if I am to move to this list of recommendations, there are quite a number of them, which I can generally group based on what can be done by individual stakeholders. But I think we shall start with the recognition of the geopolitical significance and strategic importance of the enlargement policy. Again, we have been hearing that more and more from the European politicians, and that's very welcome development. And that's something which definitely needs to be translated not only at the level of the top leadership, but also to the public opinion in the countries which remain Eurosceptic. And I think here cases like Austria is quite noticeable because, as we know, Austria is one of the countries which is quite active when it comes to enlargement policy on the political level. But if we look at the public opinion in Austria, it's actually the reverse, like not even the half of the Austrian population support the policy. So that's something which cannot be decided only in Brussels. That's the process which shall not be pushed by Brussels, but it also should be communicated and highlighted within the member states. And here, of course, we have a massive role to be played by pro-European politicians, but also by the European civil society, that we make sure that the regional perspectives from member states are favorable, and those regional and capital perspectives are pushing the political decisions which would move the enlargement process forward. Then we, of course, have the question of the credibility of the process. And that was something which was particularly acute, once again, before the decision on Ukraine and Moldova, because the popular thinking was that we have seen the waiting line for the enlargement policy for 20 years for some of the countries, and out of sudden you have just 2 new candidates who are pushing for the fast-track accession. How is it fair to the Western Balkans? And here, I think now, once we are in this big group of enlargement hopefuls and candidates, it's really important to emphasize the merit-based approach. I think at this stage, it's important not to calculate who has been in the waiting line for how many years, but actually each country should really strive to meet the objective expectations that are posed to ensure that its rule of law, its institutional reform, its economic situation correspond with the criteria which are necessary for moving forwards in the path of enlargement. Another aspect of the credibility is, of course, having the clear and transparent communication between all the members, and having the politically agreed set of criteria between the EU and these groups. There are a number of other issues in this block. Probably I will not dwell so much on this. I will leave it to our audience to find in the paper afterwards. But just to move forward with with other recommendations, the third big thing which I highlighted was the institutional change of the policy itself, and of course on the other policies of the EU. And here we already have some excellent proposals, so there is no need to reinvent the wheel. The proposals for gradual accessions seem to be most fit for purpose to address these challenges, because here the question is how to ensure that over the long period of time, when the countries will still try to adapt to the EU's legislation, to norms, to implement all the necessary reforms, how to make sure that these countries do not get discouraged. Of course, we saw this as a very negative experience with Western Balkans, when something which I call the vicious circle in the paper, when the Western Balkan states were not meeting the requirements and expectations set by the EU. Then when the EU was not reciprocating, also because of some political considerations, so not only the objective ones, but the ones which I mentioned before, we saw the backlash on the part of the societies of the Western Balkan states. And of course, when the spiral gets going, it's very difficult to take a step back and just to be more constructive about this process itself. So this is really important to ensure that for the time which the EU needs to take to reform itself, its decision-making procedures, to prepare itself for the potential treaty change, to rethink its institutional setup in terms of the institutions and distribution of the seats in the parliament, of the commissioner seats, and so on and so forth. And for the time when it needs to be taken by the candidate countries to fulfill all the reforms, that there is some synergy between the two. And there are some concrete deliverables which the candidate countries can feel and that their population can relate to, so that they do not consider the accession process as purely a transactional approach, but something which really changes their life and which affects their perception of the EU. So those proposals for gradual accession, and very happy that Steven is joining us today. Probably he will elaborate more on this because SEPS was at the forefront of these proposals. This is a very good basis, and that's definitely something which would be recommendable for the EU to take into consideration even this year when the Commission prepares its enlargement communication in October. And that's something which can finally be materialized as the policy. Because of course we have heard proposals from France before with a similar logic that you need to do more for more approach and of course less for less, but it has never been codified in terms of the policy itself. So it's a really good opportunity to have that on paper and as the guiding principle for whichever commission comes after the current one. And then, of course, we shall not forget that apart from this very institutional settings which need to be put in place, there is also the society dimension, and that's something which I have already mentioned briefly, but it's very risky to see the enlargement policy only something which brings the concrete benefits. It's also important to have the values affiliation, to have the sincere interest of the process, and to have the understanding of the process on the part of the candidate countries and their societies. And here, obviously, when we see quite negative dynamics with the situation with media freedom in some of the countries in the enlargement basket, when we see some corruption scandals and allegation, definitely we understand that this is a transformation which needs to involve whole societies in those countries. And it's crucial that the EU invests in communication and socialization, not only with the leadership, but also with people present in the regions, so that, again, we can bring the idea of the EU integration closer to those populations. And finally, just to conclude with the recommendations to candidate countries, I think it's crucial to avoid these dangerous statements calling for very, very quick accession. Of course, from the side of the Western Balkans now, it's impossible to consider the calls for the quick accession after years in this enlargement negotiations and process. But what we are seeing from the side of Ukraine and Moldova with some particular timelines, and then we also have the population which probably is not very well aware about the process and the institutional setup per se. It's quite dangerous to create the expectations which, unless they are met, can result in the huge Euroscepticism in the countries which are quite favorable towards the EU. So it's really important for the EU, when it communicates with the leaders, also to explain the value of the process itself, and definitely not to slow down the process superficially, but just to make sure that there is no gap of the understanding what it means in terms of concrete steps which have to be undertaken by governments, by the authorities at all levels, but also as societies at large. And on this, I think it's also something which is a great perspective for now this enlarged amount of countries in the enlargement basket, is the intra-candidates cooperation, if I call it this way. We saw that from the side of the frontrunners of the Western Balkan bloc last year, when they supported Ukraine's and Moldova's applications. We also saw that with the recent summit of the European political community, that there is a will on the part of progressive governments of Eastern European states and Western Balkan states to cooperate, to push together for some of the initiatives. And this is very crucial to keep this productive cooperation, because of course we are talking about the merit-based approach when each country will be assessed based on its individual progress. At the same time, when you have a group of like-minded countries who try to do better, who try to progress, it's always better to have them not as rivals, but as allies. And I think right now we have really good tendency towards that, and I hope it stays in place. So those were quite a few things I wanted to highlight in this very brief presentation. Once again, to stress that this year will be crucial for the enlargement policy. Again, the first communication by the European Commission on all 10 candidates, on all 10 countries that are covered by the enlargement policy. Then we also have the midterm review of multi-annual financial framework of the EU, which is important if we consider increasing funds for the instruments for pre-accession assistance and funds for the countries which are covered by the enlargement policy. And the level of discourse and preparation for the next elections will also be quite crucial for following and also for affecting by the side of candidate countries if they want to have some positive decisions before the next European Parliament elections. So thank you very much. That is briefly it from my side.
Thank you very much for this overview, Khrystyna. I think your presentation really showed that enlargement remains to be a moving target, and there are quite a list of factors we need to take into consideration, and there are many arenas that require focus and improvement both on the side of the EU institutions, EU member states, as well as the candidate and prospective candidate countries. Against that background, I would now give the floor to Stephen and maybe also ask him to elaborate a little bit also on his views regarding this idea of a gradual approach to the enlargement process that Khrystyna was also mentioning and endorsing in her paper. But of course, Stephen, feel free to comment beyond that as well.
Yes, thank you very much. And congratulations, Khrystyna, for the paper, which is imminent. I understand we had Florian and I the privilege of reading the paper beforehand, but I think it still needs to be published, and that's immediately answering, I think, a question in the chat by Ian Bond. I wanted to make 5 quick points in reaction to some of the things you said during the presentation, and then some additional thoughts. First, you started out by saying that well, enlargement is back in a geopolitical interest. Yes, it's one way of saying that the EU has in fact always been geopolitical, at least in its international posture on the European continent, and using enlargement policy in a geographical sense. You know, IR purists might balk at the idea because, of course, the EU is not a state and doesn't wield enough punch to back up its word with military force if needed. But in a very narrow understanding of IR theory, perhaps this is indeed a token that the EU was geopolitical almost from the start. Now, some have said that the European Council conclusions of June 2022, granting candidate country status to Ukraine and Moldova in particular, amounted to a geopolitical decision. I'm not sure whether it was really a decision. You didn't say that, by the way, but I have more the feeling that the EU was pushed. You know, the EU 27 hand was collectively forced by the geopolitical momentous events, of course, on the continent, the moral authority of the Ukrainian armed forces in pushing back and in supporting, fighting for EU values, and of course the Zelensky effect. So I wouldn't go as far as to use geopolitical the geopolitical label in that context. But semantics aside, second point, you point to the strategic significance of EU enlargement, first for the European Union. And one of the arguments you make there is the long-term perspectives of the EU, given its demographic decline, especially the addition of a very populous country like Ukraine might offset some of the trends and actually be to the benefit of EU member states. I think this argument cuts both ways, and one should be perhaps careful in using it, if not to stoke up populist concern about a Polish plumber 2.0, or is it the Ukrainian netizen or logistical worker 2.0 phenomenon from taking hold. Of course, there is an economic benefit for existing EU member states, which is currently certainly a driver in the calculation of many of them. I wouldn't necessarily push that argument, given the fact that it will also cost the European Union quite a bit. And you refer to budgetary concerns, of course. The reform of the common agricultural policy, in particular, will be a hot potato to peel. And as you also point out in the paper, of course, the need for substantially different envelopes of money, leaving reconstruction aside. But at figures pre-22 figures would ask for considerable structural funding, of course, not just for Ukraine but also for Moldova and if perhaps also Georgia, which is my third point. Georgia is currently absent in the political debate already. It seems that people have dissociated Georgia already from the process, looking at how the Georgian Dream-led government has acted and reacted over the past few months since being given that European perspective. This will be a particularly difficult needle to thread, I think, for the EU come the European Council summit of December this year, when, if the Commission in its enlargement strategy concludes that Georgia, perhaps unlike Ukraine and Moldova, has not fully met all of the conditions set forth in the Commission's opinion from June last year to merit progress on its pre-accession process and be granted candidate country status, then this message, of course, could be used and abused by a problematic leadership in Georgia. Let's call a spade a spade. And so here, I don't have the answer, by the way, but perhaps you do. It's an invitation to think about it collectively, perhaps. What carefully crafted diplomatic language ought to be used in order to keep pro-reformist tendencies and forces alive in Georgia, whilst not at the same time presenting, raising expectations too much. I wanted to come back slightly to the strategic significance of the enlargement process in terms of the reference in your paper to the expansion of a zone of shared EU values. Yes, in principle. I'm sure Florian will have more to say about that in a short while. I will just note at this stage that in many of the countries that have joined the European Union in the last couple of years, decades, almost 2 decades, the political landscape is not as diverse as that in older member states in Western Europe. I would note, for example, that true social democratic parties do not exist in some of those member states, as is actually the same for Ukraine. I mean, hardly exists. So the expansion of the European Union, as far as the political landscape in Europe is concerned, and thus also the definition of policy agendas in the future, will tend to move to the right at current political tendencies, of course, and trends. Let me then turn to the invitation also that Zsuzsanna offered and say a little bit about, well, the terminological inflation which we've witnessed over the last months, with the introduction of terms of gradual, accelerated, step by step, and indeed we've added to it staged accession. I would make a clear difference between what the European Commission and the member state, and some member states seem to be keen on pushing at the moment, of course, in Ukraine, given the war, totally understandable to extend unilaterally all kinds of benefits, such as liberalization of goods exports to the European Union from Ukraine, green lanes and what have you. Sectoral integration, therefore, the reference is often made to the extension of the free roaming zone, of course, now also found in the context of the European political community for Moldova, at least prior to that EPC summit was it announced by Ursula von der Leyen on visiting Chisinau. This type of sectoral integration, vertical in nature, providing access to elements of the single market, is attractive, of course, and may speed up, when properly implemented, the ultimate accession negotiations in those particular fields. But I would note that as of now, it is dissociated from the fundamentals, justice, sector reform, rule of law, fight against corruption, etc., which are the fundamentals underpinning the enlargement methodology, open first, tracked throughout, closed last, which in the staged accession model which we have proposed is essential to moving in a more horizontal fashion from stage to stage, and thus accruing the type of funding benefits and access to EU bodies and institutions gradually, but dependent on a more horizontal, monitored, and as we have advocated, quantified to a large extent, monitoring system. The final point I wanted to make is the timeline, which Khrystyna also mentioned. I think it's absolutely key. You're right. You see left and right, of course, all kinds of initiatives now between smaller groups of member states. You have a Franco-German task force on EU institutional reform. We've seen the letter that some of the foreign ministers published in Politico as yet another example of member states pushing qualified majority voting in the council. And you see on the enlargement track, of course, also some ideas being developed in wider circles of member states. The tetragon, for example, between France, Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic's ministries of foreign affairs and their policy planning departments, working quite actively on these notions of gradual, accelerated, staged accession. This will culminate, or should culminate, as Khrystyna rightly points out, in an enlargement strategy this October. Yet we have a fundamental problem there, not just because now the two top people are tainted for concerns of rule of law and all kinds of side deals, you know, helping ownership of a Bali hotel as the last example, which is detrimental, I think, in the Commission's own credibility in pushing fundamental first. But that left aside, the Commission has so far not come up with a structured proposal, I think, in response to the European Council's invitation from June to come up with concrete ideas across the board about gradual integration and reversibility negotiations in case of backsliding. This is really the moment to do it, because indeed, if the Commission at the same time concludes that Ukraine in particular meets the conditions set forth in the avis of June, then the leaders in the European Council in December will have to face the question whether or not to open accession talks with Ukraine and or Moldova and or Georgia and or Bosnia and Herzegovina, I don't know. Already in December, as I said, and well, that ball or that decision could be delayed indeed, but with Khrystyna, I think that the European parliamentary election cycle, with the elections scheduled for May next year, and the campaigns, if we go for Spitzenkandidaten, I don't know, but Ursula von der Leyen has already alluded to the fact that she has an interest of maybe a second mandate, that her commission might be the Enlargement Commission, rather than the current geopolitical one. Well, okay, then that's really a moment to see those ideas which have been sloshing around for a while now, to be concretely packed in a list of political priorities for that commission and to be seen through in proper allocation of the jobs at the European Commission. So there's still a lot to be played for, I think, indeed a bit more than 12 months. So with that, apologies for perhaps having been too long, Zsuzsanna.
Thank you, Stephen, and absolutely not. You covered a lot of important points, and thank you also for touching a little bit on the gradual accession idea. I would maybe, before moving on to Florian, ask Khrystyna if you would like to immediately react on any points briefly.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. I'll just elaborate because I fully agree with, especially with your, concluding remarks and your general observations. But just a few points on the strategic significance and costs for the EU. Well, definitely. I mean, without the reform for how budget is allocated, I can't see, Ukraine having, like, if we don't talk about reconstruction, right? I can't see how the EU can accept Ukraine given how much funds it would need to allocate to such a big country. At the same time, I think that will be also part of the internal reform consultations, perhaps the reform of the budgetary instruments, because indeed, I just can't imagine it's happening. At the same time, I think we should take into account the reconstruction funds, because the EU is already and has been already providing quite a lot in terms of support to Ukraine. So I think it's also more strategic for the EU to frame this as part of this accession process, right? Not to have it on the top of something else, but just to say we are doing that because we see Ukraine in the EU. And this is why probably we won't need to finance the same needs again. So I think it's also a bit of a tricky question, but definitely it would require reforms. And of course, what we see with protests of, Polish farmers, other Eastern European farmers, we already see how difficult it can be when we come to particular points of accession negotiations, given that, well, it's a bit easier with smaller countries, but particularly with Ukraine, it's quite problematic. But also talking about the cost and projections, of course, we, in this assessment, we depart from the current time, from current date. I think if we look like 20, 30 years ahead, perhaps, with the democratic, I hope not democratic crisis, but with the demographic crisis, perhaps it can change a bit the calculations, because with the European population decreasing with every year, it's also the matter of getting a bit bigger at the expense of enlargement can be another demographic consideration that we can add here. So just to differentiate that, as we see it from now, it's very costly. At the same time, if we consider the broader, more far-reaching time horizon, perhaps it changes the calculation a bit. And about Georgia, I fully agree. I mean, I don't have any recipe for Georgia. As the country in which the state is now, I can't see it being recognized as the candidate this year. So it's indeed about crafting diplomatic messages and trying to work with the other actors in the Georgian society to keep basically the positive attitude towards the EU. But with the current government, it would be very difficult to achieve any breakthrough. So probably those are just the couple of additional remarks, but thanks again.
Thank you very much, Khrystyna. Without further ado, I would give the floor to Florian. Florian, you have been working on the Western Balkans. You are maybe most familiar with that region. How do the past years' developments have influenced the enlargement process in regard to the Western Balkans, and what are your views on Khrystyna's proposals, recommendations in terms of the reform when it comes to the Western Balkan countries?
Yes, thanks a lot, Zsuzsanna, and I really appreciate being on this panel, and appreciate having had the chance to read Khrystyna's paper as well as hearing to the presentation, listen to the presentation. Yes, I mean, I would start with that. I think the candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova is great news for the Western Balkans. Not all of my colleagues in the Western Balkans would agree with that. Some are quite skeptical and worried. Some are worried because there's a sense of being left aside, and I think Khrystyna was alluding to it in the sense that, if it's merit-based, then the length of the waiting in the queue shouldn't be important, but the merits of the individual candidates. Of course, the worry in the Western Balkans is that the process is not merit-based. And I think this is one of the big concerns, that Ukraine and Moldova were fast-tracked so far, even though some of the countries of the Western Balkans have the same level of preparedness. I think that can be discussed, but I think it's certainly the perception. I think it's good news, though, because of, well, I think two important reasons. First of all, the more the merrier, and not because it's a party, but because it creates more pressure for the process in each of the countries to continue, including the enthusiasm we have at the moment coming from Moldova and Ukraine towards enlargement, which, you know, we hope will be contagious this way around rather than the pessimism of the Western Balkans towards Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. And then the other point is that it gets an upgrade in the European Union. I mean, I think this is quite essential, and you mentioned it as well in your paper, how the very fact that we have a commissioner in charge of enlargement who has a political agenda which is not compatible with rule of law and democracy has undermined it, and it's because it was a low priority on the list of commissioners. So Hungary could get the portfolio because nobody else really was eager to have it. And I think this is going to change. First of all, nobody is eager to see a Hungarian commissioner under the Orban government in charge of enlargement when Ukraine is included. I think that would be in nobody's favorite. And also it's become more important, so it's a more desirable portfolio. And all of that helps also the Western Balkans. So that's positive. I think you've mentioned very well the challenges the countries of the Western Balkans have faced. And so it is very important to manage expectations in Ukraine and Moldova towards enlargement, because even if the process, if there seems to be for the first time a willingness in the EU to think more creatively about the project, whether it is, as Stephen has mentioned, in the sectoral integration or in even thinking about staged accession, as some member states are, along the lines of Stevens and the paper which has been widely circulated by CEPS and the Center in Belgrade. So from that point of view, there is thinking in directions which was, I think, not really welcome before Ukraine and Moldova came into the equation. The answer one often heard in Brussels and EU capitals was, there is a path, if there's a will, there's a way, why don't you just do it? So that, that has changed, and that, the realization now we are talking about the 20th anniversary of Thessaloniki coming up in these weeks. In fact, we at the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisor Group are releasing a paper in 10 days about lessons learned from the long wait. I mean, 20 years waiting for membership is way too long. Only Croatia joined. So clearly, this is not something we want to tell Ukraine, saying, congratulations, you're a candidate. Now, please wait 20 years or 15 years. This is hardly helpful. So the issue I would underscore here is two matters. In the EU, the need for political commitment to the process, and not just saying we want enlargement, but doing what it takes to get enlargement done. Because we all know, and Khrystyna mentions it in her paper, there are a number of issues which are beyond the formal support for enlargement, such as de-bilateralizing the enlargement process, because the Bulgarian experience when it comes to the veto towards North Macedonia, the previous French veto and the Greek veto, have normalized the bilateralization of the enlargement process, or the use of the enlargement process for bilateral issues. And that is something which will have negative repercussions for all of the countries, including Moldova and Ukraine. There's no doubt about it. It could be neighbors, could be Hungary, it could be countries who just don't want enlargement, it could be countries who worry about the agricultural sector, it could be countries for all kinds of reasons. And it probably will be impossible to get into a full qualified majority process, save the last step, which is, of course, the ratification. But one could really try to reduce the veto points. And I think this, I would think, would be very important in the whole discussion about changing it, reducing the veto points to the maximum, because it's important to keep in mind that Bulgaria only vetoed North Macedonia after France vetoed it. If it happened a year earlier, Bulgaria would have not done it because the issue was not salient on the domestic political agenda. So it's often a certain set of circumstances which make these vetoes attractive. It's not that countries are waiting for them all along, but it's if domestic circumstances allow it, they use it. And the more opportunities there are, the more likely it is to go wrong. So it's the, it's in a certain way an opportunity which is there to be abused. So that would be quite essential. And it's also about the political will of the member states, not just to reform the technical sides of the process, which was mentioned, but also to change, in a certain way, the political dynamism, which means really keeping it on, talking about whatever institutional preparation the EU itself has to do, discussing budget issues, really kind of proactively discussing it. When we had the 2004 enlargement, there was a strong sense that this is the thing which the EU wants to do and wants to complete. Initially, of course, there was a lot of skepticism. When in the 90s, it wasn't immediately clear that there was a wide consensus. But once it began, there was a certain kind of dynamic which was hard to stop. And I think this dynamic we have to recreate to say, okay, now we have 6+2 with 2 more countries more or less frozen in different ways. Georgia in the perspective, but not in the candidate status. Turkey having negotiated, but not really going forward. But there is a large pool of countries. Let's get those who are willing to do it really moving and think of it, not of a date, but think of a process which leads to goal by a particular point in time, and not saying we're going to just negotiate. I mean, as the process was called for accession negotiations, no, we should talk about accession dates and a finality, at least for some of the countries, which shows it's attainable at this point, which this kind of expectation has gone. So I think this is very essential. It's not about just the models, but it's also about the political commitment. Now, this applies to the EU member states and the EU institutions, but it also applies to the countries. And I think this is the other problem we have in the Western Balkans. There isn't really the widespread political commitment to join the European Union. Yes, we have governments which are pro-EU integration, but it's not the whatever it takes kind of EU integration. It's more this, yes, of course, we're also for EU integration and we're for, LGBTQI rights and we're for that and this, but this is like just a list of things, of kind of statements rather than, the we'll do what it takes. We don't have this atmosphere, partly because citizens have become cynical about EU enlargement. They don't believe it's going to happen. Governments have become complacent. And we also have, a very mixed picture when it comes to rule of law and democracy in the region. We have one country, in particular Serbia, which is clearly no longer a functional democracy at the current point in time. We have other countries which have certain challenges, democratic challenges, like Bosnia and Herzegovina has had. We also have Albania, which has its own democratic challenges with a dysfunctional opposition and a government which is dominated by one person very strongly. We have in North Macedonia a government which is very weak and likely to be replaced by a more authoritarian nationalist government next year. And so the picture in the region is that we don't have the reform kind of front runners at the moment, which really push the agenda forward. Montenegro could become that again, but could become that, but that remains to be tested. So what we're lacking is this kind of dynamism on both sides at the moment. And the Ukraine and Moldova's candidate status and kind of enthusiasm has some potential, but we haven't seen it translate in the region into new dynamism. And the candidate status for Bosnia has not really changed anything in reality. Nothing is different in Bosnia. There's not more enthusiasm to join the EU, nor is the government more reform oriented. So it's just in a certain way a formality. So I believe that there needs to be a kind of this signal, which Khrystyna was talking about and which Stephen was also mentioning towards the second half of this year, which really says this is the way to do this. It's different than just this kind of never-ending negotiations. You have to deliver, but then you get it and it's very clear and it's very tangible. And then trying to kind of promote countries which, kind of really are trying their best to do it. Seize the moment. We discovered that countries have to seize the moment. And, we had a much more enthusiasm and space in North Macedonia a few years ago, and that enthusiasm is gone now. we've wasted an opportunity, and it's not a loss just for North Macedonia. Every neighbor sees it, and Serbia sees it, Bosnia, everywhere sees it. Why should we make difficult compromises? Why should we compromise on issues of national identity if we're just going to get a veto by EU member state and then get nothing in return? It's a recipe for losing elections. And why should any government take risks? And I mean, EU integration is a risk-taking enterprise. It offers some rewards, but this, in a certain way, the risks which are required have not been rewarded. And we have to, in a certain way, encourage the reformist momentums, which they are, by really investing into them, rather than to saying, well, let's see, first prove your track record, and then down the road, maybe you get a reward. And by that time, we'll have another government in power, and that momentum is gone. So I think to kind of conclude, there isn't yet the political momentum for enlargement. The opportunity is there, but it remains to be filled with substance and with a political commitment on both sides to really lead to a tangible conclusion in the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much, Florian. In the meantime, we started to receive questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much for that. I would encourage our audience to keep them coming. Khrystyna, I would like to give you the floor to react to Florian, but I would also like to bring in a couple points from the Q&A already. Maybe we can bundle things together a little bit. Specifically now related to the Western Balkans. So regarding the reform momentum, Florian was voicing that there are indeed challenges in this regard. And here, one follow-up question to this from Milan Mich from the EAP is whether you, Florian, and also you, Khrystyna, do you see any potential change? What are your hopes in this regard until December? Would you expect any change? But beyond that, staying with the Western Balkans, I would bring in a question that we have received from Dragos Jonica. Obviously, enlargement is one thing, but when we look at the Western Balkans, there is more to tackle than just domestic political reforms. So how do you see the EU's role also in the region going beyond enlargement as a geopolitical actor in terms of conflict resolution, in terms of contributing to the resolution of bilateral conflicts between the various countries, also in the context of a broader competition in the region that Khrystyna actually mentions in her paper. Khrystyna, I would give you the floor now, and then also to Florian, if you would like to follow up on this topic.
Yes, so I'll try to address some of the questions because I think for some others, Florian will have a much better overview of the situation on the ground in Western Balkans. But about the regional dynamics, I think actually, no, let me just make a step back. So in terms of, momentum and opportunity, I think like now we're at the stage when EU is trying to create this momentum because we saw varying dynamics, right? Like at some points, Western Balkans were banging on the door of the EU and just like trying to get some, recognition of their progress. Now we see perhaps more reserved attitude from the side of Western Balkan countries. At the same time, EU, as we discussed the timeline, this year is quite crucial. So we'll probably see more proposals from the European leadership, which can try to revive this enthusiasm. Of course, this enthusiasm will not be as high as it used to be before, but I guess it's still better than just the plain attitude from both sides. So now it's the ball is at the EU's side, but of course, that does not come for free. Like that should come in exchange for some progress demonstrated. Like we can't just advance if there is nothing to advance on. But speaking about the regional dynamics in this very context, I think actually it's a good demonstration of how the enlargement policy can be used both for EU's geopolitical initiatives and on some conflict resolutions on the ground with the recent talks between Serbia and Kosovo. And here, of course, we talk not only about EU, but also the transatlantic alliance at large. I would say that Kosovo's strategy now would be different if we didn't have all of those calls incoming, and all of those urges to negotiate with Serbia and conduct a new round of elections. So I think actually it's the positive example that the EU still has a weight in shaping some regional dynamics and in shaping the relationship between the countries. Of course, it's better if it's backed also by some external allies, which in the case of Kosovo is quite particular because of the attachment to the US, but still it was a positive example of the recent months. So I will just stop there that it's rather a plus than a minus, but I will give the floor to Florian to elaborate on this also.
Yeah, to follow up, I mean, to Milan's question, I mean, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, the governments are not doing are complaining rather than doing the reforms. And, I think the real trick is how to change this dynamic. And I think the offer from the European Union has to be very clear and very, very, very tangible, how to address some of the reasons why countries who did make reforms were blocked in the past, and what because North Macedonia is this example which how you have to show how you can deal with this kind of situation in the future. Otherwise, why would a country like Serbia really make the compromises? Now, I don't think the current government of Serbia is committed to it because it has its interest in not joining the European Union, but talking about it. But it's about the larger demonstration effect that the EU, in a certain way, has to demonstrate how it can make this process credible again. It might not be the current governments who deliver on it, but it might be new governments. I mean, we've had a change of government in Montenegro, so there's a government there which is, in a certain way, has to prove its record, but also can prove its record. So, I think you have to seize those opportunities and say, okay, you are untainted by past, omissions. Now let's do this. Let's get you into the European Union in the coming, 4 or 5 years. And I think this is really what it's about. I mean, some of the governments will just not deliver because they have no interest in delivering, and one should be quite clear about that. So this is the other thing with Khrystyna, I think you mentioned in your paper, as well as the toolkit, the new methodology, which was based on the French insistence, has not been really tested. I mean, the reversibility is not tested. Serbia has reversed, in many issues, has not progressed, and still there is there's no penalty, because these geopolitical calculations want to keep Serbia anchored in the EU and worry about losing it to Russia. And the president is playing on this, and this again means that the methodology is meaningless in terms of its substance when it comes to really push comes to shove. And this we need to see both the reward and the very tangible kind of reasons of how to circumnavigate the blockages, but also the consequences for non-alignment with foreign policy, for all of what is going on, because otherwise also again the EU is seen as being too soft on those who are breaking the rules.
Stephen, would you maybe have any comments to this point in particular, or to the Western Balkans in general?
No, but if you want, I can pick up a question which relates to the Eastern Partnership trio.
Yes, please. I wanted to raise that to you anyway, so please go ahead.
There's a question by Irakli that asks how Ukraine and Moldova are dealing with the reforms required to advance to the next stage, and whether there's been any substantial progress in terms of rule of law, justice sector reform, and corruption. Well, we've done our own independent type of assessment, given the 7 conditions which were spelled out by the European Commission for Ukraine, the 9 conditions for Moldova, and I believe it was 12 for Georgia. Ahead of the General Affairs Council debate, which will take place in Stockholm on the 22nd of June, where essentially the 3 countries will report orally about the responses that they've given to those priorities set out in the Commission's opinions. for Ukraine and Moldova, our own assessment, which was published on 3 DCFTA website a few months ago, was that Ukraine and Moldova were really traveling in the right direction. Maybe not at the speed that they had anticipated themselves or set for themselves by the end of 2022, but still. And as far as justice sector reform, media reform, national minority protection, de-oligarchization, anti-money laundering, anti-corruption is concerned, I think the steady progress has been shown. The outcome of which might still be uncertain, but where the issue of constitutional court reform remains a stumbling block, particularly in Team Zelensky, it seems. I mean, the legislation has been adopted, but the EU has requested further changes to it. But that might still be overcome, between now and October. As far as Moldova is concerned, it's not so much constitutional court reform, but rather other elements of judicial reform, and taking up details from the Venice Commission opinion and incorporating them really in nuts and bolts, so to speak. But where otherwise in the fighting corruption, of course, it's all work in progress, right? But where the fight against grand corruption, at least, is advancing, and we've seen, of course, also on the side of the EU, new sanctions being adopted in this field, where extensive measures have been planned for de-oligarchization, where extensive measures have been set in motion as far as battling organized crime is concerned, where, well, public administration reform remains a permanent challenge, which, okay, has received some renewed attention, but which will continue to bug the government administration. As for Georgia, in comparison, I mean, there's been a lot of communication also on the side of the Georgian Dream government about how quick and how well changes have been introduced since the Commission's opinion on political polarization, for example, and de-oligarchization, which rather than the text formulated in the Commission's conditions formulated in the opinions of Ukraine and Moldova, the text requires, in fact, a higher threshold to be met in the case of Georgia, where at the face of it, substantial initiatives have been adopted, but insufficient. And we have seen a recent Venice Commission opinion being published that decries basically this this type of facade, Potemkin village facade that the Georgian government is employing. So I worry about not just the level of implementation, but especially the reluctance, to go all the way, basically, and that in the face of very vocal domestic opposition taken to the streets, having course corrected to some extent, the government's positions, but how far and how long that will be done is a matter for concern.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Khrystyna, you obviously have been following the developments around Ukraine in the course of the past year. How would you evaluate the progress made?
I very much agree with Stephen's assessment on this. And actually in Ukraine, there is also the consortium of civil society organizations which produce their independent take on the reforms. And I think that's one of the benefits of having a strong independent civil society, is that, of course, in Ukraine, civil society is largely oriented towards the EU. So definitely that's in everybody's interest to have EU join the EU as soon as possible. I think the merit of the independent analysis by civil society is that they really say things as they are. And even a half a year ago, the indicators on the 7 steps were ranked much lower than we have now. So what we saw that, as Stephen mentioned, the Constitutional Court remains the stumbling block. At the same time, some of their requirements, they have been, they had some issues on the side of the EU. Like, for instance, right now, the de-oligarchization law, which was put forward as one of the conditions. Now EU is retreating on this because there was a recommendation from the Venice Commission that it's better not to implement this before the end of the war. So basically, this is like -1 task from the Ukrainian agenda. And the similar things can happen with some other dimensions. But there is a really good progress on the judicial reform and also on the media reform. And as long as the negotiations of the minority law is being concerned, so Venice Commission has been involved. Of course, this is not a recipe for getting Hungary's approval, but that's again something that we can discuss in the context of politicization. So I think that for Ukraine now, it's important to have objectively recognized criteria and then to deal with the political issues besides that. But I also noticed some questions in the chat, which I can pick up in relation to this. For instance, there was a question about the managing expectations. I think it very much relates to this question of the progress, because also what we see with this like 7 steps or 9 steps or 12 steps, those are things which you can do and tick the boxes, and then you can just get the massive flash, basically you can have major deterioration afterwards. So that's why I think it's important not to rush too much with the enlargement process. Okay, opening of the negotiations is crucial because that's, that's your entry ticket to start this more comprehensive reforms, but that is the recipe also for having some more sustainable changes. Because, one thing is to adopt the law, which defines the structure of how the Constitutional Court should be functioning. But another thing is to have, the broader range of laws and the broader range of norms being adjusted to EU standards. So I think it's also important to communicate this to the population that this is not the enlargement process is not just the list of some criteria which you need to very quickly deliver on, and then you move forward. It's also about the transformation process. But in terms of more concrete recipes, well, I don't know how much one can be influenced on the political level, but when the Prime Minister says something that we expect Ukraine to join the EU within 2 years, I mean, it's mostly the job to be done by the civil society, also by the European Union, just to educate the population a bit more, so that people do not believe the statements, because otherwise you would see really major disappointment. So of course, one way would be to try to and softly influence how political leaders are communicated from the part of the candidate countries. That's definitely not something given that you can manage to persuade them to change the discourse, because we also understand why it's been done. But the other one is about the education about the EU as such. And I think that's crucial both for the Eastern Europe and also for the Western Balkans, just to have population more involved more in the EU discussions, and also to increase the level of awareness about the processes within the EU and also the processes which concern the accession as such. I see there are also more questions, but maybe I'll stop here in case other panelists want to address this.
Thank you very much, Khrystyna. And I would bring in a couple more questions. So we've been talking about the candidate countries' progress. Now I would move on a little bit to the EU member states. How do you see, we have a question from Jana Yuzova from Europa. How do you see, in light of this new momentum that seems to be there both on the side of major EU countries and EU institutions to some extent, although we have heard that there is some apparent slacking in terms of new strategy. Do you see that there is an understanding on the side of member states that the enlargement process itself would need to change? Is there appetite for this, in a way, more rewarding approach towards candidate countries? Do you see that member states would support that? That would be one thing that I would like to bring in. And another thing is, it was specifically raised by Anna Keller regarding the Western Balkans and how you see the role of Slovenia and Croatia. But I would broaden up this question in a way, under the current circumstances, who do you see really pushing the agenda of EU enlargement forward among the member states, and under what conditions they are supported? Where can we expect some alliance building for the reinvigoration of the enlargement process? I don't know who maybe want to jump in on any of these aspects.
If I may, I think it very much relates also to what Stephen mentioned in the opening remarks, right? It's first about the benefits. That on the declaratory level, we have, more and more proposals for like stage accession like ways to reward members, but that's mostly from the perspective of sectoral integration. And here we can talk about member states. We see that France is particularly active on that, but the role of the European institutions is crucial. We saw Charles Michel, who was very vocal about having this more for more approach, but also European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen, who just recently at the GlobSec Forum, she announced that we need to undertake new policies, new actions vis-a-vis Western Balkan countries, really to bring them closer. And as she framed that, it's the time from the European Union to deliver and bring some benefits. So she was trying to portray this in this way. Again, that's the question of how do you define benefits? Because right now we're talking about the sectoral integration benefits and the single market and roaming, all of these things. But in terms of political will and appetite, again, depends whom you ask. Definitely with the current commission, we have very good leadership in at least trying to move the process. What was also highlighted is this joint Franco-German group working on prospects for EU reform, but also in terms of the discourse, in terms of communication, trying to highlight their interests. But I think also when you talk about countries which are regional allies of particular countries, like for instance, if you talk about Poland, of course, Poland would support Ukraine on the declaratory level for sure. At the same time, you would see the agricultural protests in Poland. So I think it depends really which kind of benefits do we consider. And I think about the Western Balkan and position of Slovenia and Croatia, I will probably not be in the position to elaborate on that. So perhaps Florian can answer the question about the regional dynamics there. And also, Stephen, please feel free to complement this question about benefits and leadership.
Yeah, I mean, to continue, I mean, I think first of all, the problem is really that I mean, there are actually few member states who are openly against enlargement nowadays. But the question is, how serious are they about it, and under which terms? Because certainly we have what I call the false friends of enlargement, like Hungary at the moment, which is not helping. And so I'm not sure that this, what Jana is talking about, this geopolitical reality is there. It's this kind of classical, yes, but my issues still matter. And I think it's only when also the political cost of individual member states becomes too high to actually oppose membership, and also when it becomes a packet, and not a packet of joining, but understood as a packet in a certain way. So if Poland pushes for enlargement because of Ukraine, other countries push because of they have support for others. That helped in the 2004 enlargement, right? Greece came on board because of Cyprus, but then was helping with the overall process. So certainly kind of create. Everybody gets something out of this process, or sees has a political stake in it, and I think that's going to be quite important. We don't have this kind of group yet where we see countries pushing for it, but certainly the kind of blockages which we've seen a few years ago are not there. France is not likely to block again, as we've seen it. But we have again, and this comes to the question about Slovenia and Croatia. officially on paper, they're pushing for enlargement, but Croatia is a country which has very much pursues its bilateral issues again through enlargement, which means it supports sometimes Bosnia, but does it with also pushing for a very nationalist view of how Bosnia should change. And I think we all fear or worry that Croatia might impose a veto on Serbian accession down the road, because there are plenty of open bilateral issues. It has had no need, because the current government of Serbia is perfectly capable of sabotaging its own EU membership bid, doesn't need Croatia for it. But at the end of the day, I think Croatia might put the foot down on some issues which are not merit-based, but which are based again on its own bilateral issues. So I think all of the neighbors, of course, have that potential, issue that Greece has some open issues with Albania. Romania in the past had some issues with Serbia. None of them were big enough, but again, they all have the potential in the domestic political constellation to blow up and create a blockage, as long as it's seen as a legitimate, acceptable way in the EU to do it. If it's generally frowned upon, institutionally harder, and there's a strong pressure to kind of get this process completed, then I think it's going to be harder to play that role. But at the moment, we don't have that yet.
Yeah, let me add a few other member states and refer to the last question, or is it in fact an observation in the chat box? Germany has certainly upped its game, with Sarrazin traveling frequently, of course, to the region. It was to a certain extent also surprising for me to see Scholz join Macron and Borrell in Moldova during the second summit of the EBC to try and knock heads together with Vucic and Kurti, unsuccessfully so, it seems. But it's indicative of an increased awareness of the importance of the Balkans and moving them forward in Berlin, for sure. There are others on the call who could speak more to that. What I wanted to point out is is a rather curious, to put it in perfect French, Zeitenwende by Monsieur Macron in Bratislava. Is it really? We'll have to see. It's certainly a marked change from earlier speeches and the traditional posture of France to oppose EU enlargement, except for perhaps Greece. What we have observed when going around with our stage accession model and discussing it with officials in member state capitals is that in France there is a serious interest in this idea, but that it really hinges on the viability of the other side of the grand bargain, which is, okay, the EU willing to then grant accelerated access to its bodies and institutions, and an observer role at first, of course, for candidate countries, not with voting rights, with enhanced forms of financial support. But then on the other side, the acceptance of new member states to see their veto powers in the council curbed for a temporary period of time, in as far as unanimous decision making goes in the council, whereby I think it is perfectly legal. We've tried to investigate this, and we'll come out with a paper in a few weeks' time to defend the notion that this does not create a second-class membership if applied across all applicant countries, even the UK, if it were to reapply for membership of the EU. And if it is, of course, an intention to meet overriding governance objectives for the European Union itself, which are embedded in the treaties themselves. So to have a more efficient, better functioning European Union and governance system, the extension of qualified majority is, of course, already under discussion as one of the ways to advance that. Temporarily suspending the possibility to issue a negative vote, which is hardly ever issued, by the way, in council decision making. I mean, the council bodies are a consensus shaping organism in a way, and thus would grant still perfect opportunities for new member states in stage 3 after accession to shape council decisions also in package deals with others. But that temporary suspension is deemed absolutely key in Paris to endorse the stage accession model. And so yeah, it does come with conditions. On the budgetary front, concerns are often mentioned, both in this respect, and also security concerns, of course. The ultimate, sovereign decision, which would lie with the constitutional power at the national level. There, we are proposing the inclusion of an emergency brake, which already exists in the CFSP in the current treaty, whereby individual countries can block a decision being taken by qualified majority voting for vital and stated reasons of national interest, which will have to be restrictively interpreted, obviously. But to apply such an emergency brake essentially to the proposal of a suspension of veto rights for new member states. So that would be the safety valve for them. The other concerns, financial, what's it all going to cost? Here, the midterm review of the MFF, as Khrystyna has mentioned, and is also in her paper, will be a key moment to assess whether indeed, this extra cost can be factored in already for candidate countries that start negotiations as soon as next year, basically. So under the current commission, even. I don't see it happening that quickly, but it might, in theory, happen. So, well, there's a lot to be played for, and I think those are especially the key concerns by France, but also other member states. The Hague, of course, and Copenhagen have traditionally played, that role as well. Can I just mention, sorry, I forgot. What struck me in the political debate is that you have states on the eastern flank in particular, and I'm calling from Tallinn, heavily advocating for membership of Ukraine in particular into the European Union, but eschewing any type of debate on institutional reform or giving up on their own veto right in the council. And there are some cracks here, and Slovenia is an interesting case which has joined this friends group for QMV, not so the Baltic states. I think there, if those states, Poland included, are serious about accession of Ukraine, then they should be serious about an EU institutional reform debate, which also touches upon council decision making.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very important point, especially this last one that you added. So thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we are slowly approaching the end of our allocated 90 minutes. So I would give you the opportunity for a quick round of concluding remarks, maybe in 1 minute, to recap what you maybe consider the most important takeaway from your end. But I would also like to draw the attention to our audience to the chat where I have posted Khrystyna's paper, so you can download it from there. And after our event, it will also be available on the website of the German Marshall Fund. Having said that, Khrystyna, I would now give you the floor for a quick conclusion.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this really rich discussion and with multiple perspectives from Western Balkans, from the EU, from Eastern Europe. So I think we have covered a lot. There are still some questions which we haven't, but I will try to incorporate them in my concluding remarks. So as we discussed, definitely last year's decision and developments were really historic. At the same time, the developments which we have seen in the past year. So since Ukraine and Moldova granted the candidate status, I think the changes there are also crucial. And that is linked to the momentum that we discussed. That's the timing of this year. And also there was the question about what happens if there is a change of leadership in one of the key countries. So I think it's linked, like, if now there is the political will from the EU side to move forward, then there should be also political will, incorporating Steven's last comments, to move forward in the comprehensive way, right? Not only announce some very random decisions which will not have more structural dimension of it when it comes to EU internal situation, but if there is the willingness and if there are political leaders in the key capitals and the leadership of EU institutions which are ready to undertake this task, it really needs to be done on multiple fronts. So that would probably be my key conclusion, that all of these things, they need to be reformed in parallel. They can't be contingent on each other, but if the time to act is any time is actually now. So probably I'll end here. And thank you very much again. And a special thanks to Zsuzsanna, Florian, Steven for your contributions today and for your reviews.
Thank you very much, Khrystyna. And quick conclusion from Florian, maybe?
Yes, I mean, I think the paper as well as the timing is fortuitous in terms of now is a time to indeed do something about this. I think we have the right overall political constellation there, which could lead to a realistic enlargement process for Ukraine, Moldova, potentially for Georgia and the Western Balkans. I think we haven't yet seen the institutional and political details of it, and this is something which we'll have to, look for, push for, to create the momentum. And I think it requires, in a certain way, thinking of enlargement as a bigger joint project of both those regions, with a clear, attainable timeline, again, not a date, but a timeline and a process which is not open-ended. And that has to be, I think, understood in the European Union, and everything has to be set in motion to do this. Again, I think it's not going to be easy to get there, especially with internal differences in the EU, with some undemocratic, voices in the European Union as well. But I think in a certain way, if we lose this momentum again, we're going to have again a never-ending discussion about enlargement, and now just enriched by Ukraine, and with high expectations and low follow-up, will be even more detrimental, I think, to the credibility of the European Union down the road. And I think this needs to be understood by political leaders in the European Union, that not making enlargement happen has a political cost as well, and a credibility cost, which is not negligible.
Thank you very much, Florian. Steven, maybe a few more thoughts.
I would be repeating what others have said so eloquently, so I share those sentiments. I would just add that the momentum that we are seeing is very much on the civil society front and among member states. It's high time that the Commission gets up and shows and proves its mettle, and so it has everything to play for the enlargement strategy to be published in October.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today on the panel and also in the audience. I think we have indeed covered a lot of angles of the topic, and this is something that will definitely stay with us for the coming months. The remainder of this year will be crucial for the enlargement policy, as we have seen, both from the side of the European Commission as well as from the side of the candidate countries. So we will be closely following it also from our end at the German Marshall Fund. Once again, Khrystyna, Florian, Steven, I would like to thank you for being here with us today and sharing your insights. Khrystyna, also congratulations to you for the publication of the paper. As I said, you can download it from the chat and we will be sharing it on our channels. With this, thank you again, everybody. We'll be concluding the sessions, and please stay tuned. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook for similar such events that will be coming up in the future. Once again, thank you so much for being here with us today. Goodbye.